Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this online event organized by the European Policy Center to analyze the results of the elections in Kosovo that took place yesterday, as well as their implications for Kosovo's EU path. My name is Berta López. I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Center, following the Western Balkans and EU enlargement policy. And today I am joined by three speakers: Agon, Maliqi, a freelance researcher and analyst; Engjellushe, Morina, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations; and Una Hajdari, freelance journalist, who are going to help me understand and analyze the results of yesterday's elections. This event is part of the Election Monitor, which is an EPC flagship event to monitor and analyze elections throughout Europe and look at their implications for the EU. I will start with with an exchange with the panelists. I will start by asking them a few questions on the results and their implications, and then I will open the floor for questions from the audience. So I encourage all of you to prepare your questions. You can put them, write them already in the Q&A box which you are going to find in your screens, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand and ask your questions live when the time comes. Having said that, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the results and then give the floor to our speakers. According to the latest results, which, if I'm not wrong, for now, like the latest we have is with 88% of the votes counted. Domènech, the ruling party by Prime Minister Kurti, won the election with 41% of the results, followed by the Democratic Party of Kosovo with 22%, the Democratic League of Kosovo with 18%, and the Alliance for the Future of Kosovo with 8%. What these results, like the first thing that these results tell us is that Kurti's party has won again the election, but has lost the majority that it got in 2021, where they got over 50% of the vote, which allowed them to rule on their own. Now it seems that this is no longer be possible, meaning that doors are open, like to see what will happen and who's going to be able to govern. Having said that, I'm going to give the floor to the speakers. I'm going to first ask you about what's your reading of the results. What are your expectations, and when do you think that we can expect the final results to be ready? I will start by giving the floor to Agon, and then whoever wants to continue, either Engjellushe or Una.
Thank you, Berta, and hi to everyone. Yeah, the most recent results that you mentioned are by the Election Commission are the ones you mentioned. I think around 10% more of the votes are supposed to be counted, the one that had been cast in Kosovo, and then there's a batch of votes also coming from the diaspora. But I think these two balance each other out in terms of I don't expect them to change the math, math meaningfully. So, some party might win a little bit more, one or two MPs, but that doesn't change the big picture much. And the results, I think, preliminary at least, should come out officially fairly soon, the full ones. What does this mean? Well, there's lots of ways to frame this. The governing party tried to frame this as a kind of referendum and asking for a full mandate, asking for 500,000 votes. So it came short, way short from that. So yes, it came out first, but not with what it wanted. So it's kind of a relative victory. The opposition parties grew from the last time around, so it's a better result for them, especially the PDK, the second one, less for the LDK. So that's a positive for them, but they did not get as much as they expected. But they can claim one thing is that together they have a bigger sort of majority than Kurti now. So the previous opposition is now actually a majority in numbers in parliament. So by projection, Domènech will have somewhere around 44 to 46 MPs, and 61 is the magic number for a government. whereas the opposition combined has somewhere between 54 and 56. So so this is kind of the underlying math. So everybody won, nobody won. It's kind of unclear. I would call this an inconclusive result. Based on the framing of the past, because Kurti basically ran against all of the opposition. So there was a narrative that these are elections between Kurti and all of the opposition. So if it's looked like that, then yes, the opposition gained. What does this mean is that I think the voters basically are forcing consensus, because Kurti will have to have a coalition partner. The strange thing about that is that last night he held a electoral rally, like a victory rally, sort of trying to put a more positive spin to the result, in which he was harshly attacking the opposition. So it did not seem like the kind of spirit, basically calling them all kinds of names. It doesn't seem like a kind of spirit of looking for that consensus or that partner. That was, to me, a strange part. On the other hand, you have the opposition parties, the previous opposition parties, which are now, as I said, the majority in the Albanian part of the parliament, who are, I would say, not really happy in this position. They're happy that they grew, but they're not really enthusiastic about the idea of a grand opposition coalition. They can do that. They can do that. With the ethnic minorities, because it would highly likely not be a very stable government that could push through a full mandate. And that I'll maybe end to this part, which I think people have to realize what else is at stake, is that the full mandate of the government will not just depend on getting to 61 votes, which the opposition can easily do right now with the minorities. It's that next year, Kosovo has to elect its president in the parliament. We don't have elections direct. The parliament has to elect. So whoever forms a government now will not only need to have the 61, it will need to have a way to get to 80, because you need a quorum of 80 MPs to sit at parliament when the president is elected. And if you don't have that, next year we'll go to early elections again. So this would then mean that the opposition would only have like a year mandate, and they're not really enthusiastic about the option of joining the against Kurti with all the ethnic minorities, and then not having the numbers to elect the president next year. So this is where the kind of pickle is now with the math. Does Kurti reach out to any of the and this is also impacts Kurti's decision, because it will not be enough for him to get only one of the smaller opposition parties. He will have to go for one of the bigger ones. If he's thinking for a four-year mandate, he will most likely have to deal with someone like the Democratic Party of Kosovo. And that opens up a very complex sort of realignment in the scene. And yeah, so I'll end here in terms of the implications for Kosovo, and I will not talk about the regional dynamics. Maybe I'll people can ask questions about that, and I'll let Engjellushe and Una, sort of have their take as well. Thanks.
I don't know who wants to take the floor now. I would ask you, like, whoever wants to be the next, whether you think, which of the options you think it's more feasible, whether like a grand coalition by the opposition or Kurti getting into a coalition government with one of the opposition parties.
Engjellushe, go ahead, please.
I could. Thank you, Berta. Like I said before we started, I'm not very good at speculating who's going to go with whom. But maybe I can, with regards to governing coalition, but maybe I can say a couple of things about what I was expecting to see from these elections, especially two positive developments that were not there, or maybe one of them could turn out to be, which is the participation of Serb community in these elections. So I don't have a lot of information right now, but there has been some participation. And considering the background that in the past 2 or 3 years, they decided not to participate, which is really not good for further developments of Kosovo as a state, but also inter-ethnic relations in Kosovo. So I think if that happened, if the Serbian community participated a little bit more than what we have seen in the recent years, this is something positive that I expected to see. Another positive thing that I got very disappointed with and didn't happen is one of these parties, which is basically AK, and Nisma not passing the threshold. But they did, unfortunately. And the reason I say this is because I think there is a serious need for a sophistication of political scene in Kosovo, which is not happening. We have LDK since before the war, actually. LDK is a product of the 90s, and then they turned to reform, they tried to reform themselves in early 2000s, and especially after the last elections. But unfortunately, the very kind of visible reforms, tangible reforms are not in sight within LDK, although there are a lot of new names and young professionals in the leadership, but also part of the party. So this is one of the, I don't know, one of the reasons why I say there has to be a sophistication. Plus, I mean, the fact that we still deal with PDK, with, you know, Democratic Party of Kosovo, that has been there since after the war in 99, with a lot of, you know, how shall I say, with a lot of criticism as part of its history. It's still there, fighting for the second place now. And I think they got the second place, quite far behind from the first place. I mean, I do agree that we can frame this in different ways. But if we were to be a little honest, the second and the third place, it's actually altogether less than the first place. So this is what I mean. We need a sophisticated political class in Kosovo, which doesn't seem to be in sight. Now, one thing I like to say, what I have realized, and I'm open to discuss this because I think it's quite an important issue that happened in these elections, is the strategic blunder of the Vetëvendosje party. They went out and said they wanted 500K votes. Total strategic blunder, because everyone now is holding to that statement of theirs. Everyone is saying, where is your 500K? In fact, they, like I said, they're the first ones and probably, you know, quite ahead from the second and the third, not probably, but so far quite ahead from the second and the third altogether. But because of this strategic blunder, they're having to deal with this. And I think last night this has frustrated them. And hence this very weird celebratory whatever gathering in the center of Pristina. But having said all this, I predict, it's still early, but I predict some instability with regards to Kosovo, not because of Kosovo's doing altogether, but we have to also bear in mind the context in and around Kosovo, the context in Europe. I mean, I would love to talk a little bit about it because Kosovo is not an isolated entity in the region. It's part of the region of Western Balkans with all its problems at the moment, some of it quite serious problems. And then it's also part of this EU integration or Euro-Transatlantic integration that is not going anywhere. And it has some pessimistic you know, predictions right now. So I'll stop here, but I just wanted to share these, you know, positive expectations that I didn't get in the end, not fully, and also the strategic blunders that I have noticed from a distance.
Thank you, Engjellushe. Indeed, we are gonna after this initial reading of the results, we are gonna jump into discussing what the results mean both for regional dynamics and for Kosovo's EU prospects. I would now give the floor to Una. I don't know if you agree with the reading or of your two colleagues. If there's anything you would add, please feel free.
Hi, thank you everyone again for your insightful comments earlier on. Obviously, one thing that I take as a major takeaway with Kosovo elections in general, and these ones were not outside of that trend, is that unlike many countries in the region, Kosovo still has a vibrant democratic spirit. Now, that's often something that people undersell in Kosovo or don't think about it as much because let's say the mainstream Kosovo Albanian knowledge or understanding of the rest of the region is limited, and or there isn't a large interest in comparing themselves to say Bosnia or Slovenia or Croatia. And one thing as a journalist who's covered several elections in Kosovo that I always like to highlight is that it is just as likely that the strongest party will receive a sort of thrashing in the ballot box in every Kosovo election rather than the alternative, which is what you have, in Serbia, to some extent in Albania, or to a large extent in Albania, and again, to some extent in Bosnia and Croatia. This is important because Kosovo is often perceived as being less democratic or less advanced by its neighbors initially, and to some extent by Europe as well. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. You know, Kurdi is still someone who has extraordinary popularity locally and abroad, yet the support for the party fell significantly compared to the last elections. Now, this is the curse also of the incumbent party. Your voters everywhere in the world are likely to punish the party that's in power, and we saw this happen with Kurti. What I would love to have more analysis on, and any comments that I make with regards to this are going to be based on personal conclusions and not on verifiable data, is what he was punished on particularly. Were voters unhappy with something that Agon mentioned that's really important is or I think Agon mentioned. I know the speakers very well, so I forget what they said in other interviews versus here, but was he punished because of deteriorating relations with what are perceived to be deteriorating relations with the EU and to some extent the US? Or was he punished for what he was doing in the north of the country? Was he punished for, economic measures or insufficiently grandiose economic measures? Let's remember that Kurti likes to, and that Vendossi like to position themselves as the party of the working man, and so on and so forth. So it is very hard to identify what the decline was. Having said that, I would agree with Engjellushe that it is a very strong support base that he still has, a very loyal support base. We're not seeing, let's remember that in the last elections, the support base for Kurti was so large that people, at the airport in Pristina had to increase the number of flights to diaspora regions, whether they're diaspora voters who are registered abroad and didn't register in time to vote, or people who live abroad but are registered to vote in Kosovo, because those are different categories. That outpouring of support wasn't here, but just because we don't have that outpouring of support, you can't say that he didn't receive a very strong democratic mandate. With the current percentages, if they hold, again, diaspora voting might change it for a couple of seats. He is scheduled to have around 47 seats, again, adjusted within the Albanian majority seats that are proportioned based on the winners and or the ones who pass the threshold rather. 47 is around 14 seats short. He needs 61 with the minorities, obviously, to form a majority. And I don't know if the minorities will automatically go to the opposition. I think that Kurti has fostered a relationship with the minority parties in the country. That certainly applies to the Bosniak minority, to the Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian minority parties. But on the flip side, I could not imagine a scenario which we had in previous governments with some of the, until recently, opposition parties, of them forming a coalition with Srpska Lista. So I don't know what happens constitutionally. He has to be the first one. The president will grant Vendossi the first opportunity to form a government. He gets 2 of them at least. Ironically, and this is something that was mentioned a lot in the post-election analysis last night, is if I'm not mistaken, 2014 or 2013, when an opposition coalition that was formed based on a massive protest movement where a lot of the opposition parties banded together to remove primarily PDK from power. Kurti at the time, being sort of the unofficial leader of this massive opposition movement that had more seats than PDK, which was the first place party in the elections at the time, we will see sort of a reversal of fates, where Kurti, as the person in power, will now have to deal with a stronger opposition. And however this ends up playing up, I think it really, really should be stressed that it's a strong indication of the democratic spirit in Kosovo, which, in the region is a very, very big deal. And so that should be sort of a positive takeaway from the elections.
Thank you so much, Una.
Oh, and
right
one
before,
more thing, sorry, just because,
go ahead.
because it's going to get mentioned by my other speakers. My apologies for interrupting. To be completely honest, I expected more support for the 2 newer Serbian minority parties, so Srpska Demokratija and Serbian Democracy and the Serbian National Movement. I am surprised they only got, if I'm not mistaken, according to last tallies, a bit over 1,000 votes each. And this is really, for me, I thought that there was sort of a movement, which I think is very healthy for the Serbian minority, for their civic identity, for their electoral identity in the country. I thought that there would be more of a movement for people to vote for them versus Srpska Lista. Srpska Lista continues to be the strongest party. Of course, it enjoys the support of Belgrade, which is very important in determining voting behavior. It also is very important in, what is commonly or widely known as loyalty towards the institutions in Kosovo and job security amongst the Serbian community, which is often tied to Srpska Lista. So I was hoping that this democratic trend of no party being dominant as such would transfer to the Serbian community. We didn't see that in these elections, sadly.
Thank you for this last point. Before moving into EU, like implications for the EU path and like the dialogue with Serbia and so on, I would only like to understand better the situation in Kosovo. I would only ask you briefly if you can mention like which were the main topics that dominated the campaign. Agon mentioned first that Kurti and Bete Vendosje framed the election as a referendum. Then Una, you mentioned the issue of like whether Kurti was punished or like not that much supported as in 2021, either because of the economic situation or the relations with the North or the deteriorating relations with the West. Somehow, I don't know if like one of you can give a little bit of an overview of how was the campaign.
I can try very briefly. Kurti made this not just about a referendum, but his slogan was sort of this sovereignist narrative of, from corner to corner. So his centerpiece of the campaign was this North and, sort of this extension of sovereignty in the North as his sort of main achievement. And basically attacking the opposition mostly, and some elements of social justice, like, some of these support schemes were there, but they were drowned. I think this was another sort of own goal by Kurti, is that he decided to boycott most media. So his voice was only heard in social media and in some TV channels, because he framed all of the other media as being Serbian-run, Serbian agenda, opposition, oligarchic, something like that. But he left the field open to the opposition to set the narrative. The opposition parties ran entirely on the economy. So they knew that this was Kurti's weak point. It was, and plus they had two candidates who were economists, technocrats. And they did not engage with Kurti at all over the issue of the North. So they kind of totally ignored it. And I think this kind of helped them get to this sort of growth because they tried to not fall into this trap of there was other layer to it, is that the media were mostly, almost dominantly pro-opposition, and there was attacks against Kurti were more prominent. But in general, opposition sort of tried to stay clean, have a positive campaign, and I think this paid off for them ultimately. Whereas I think Kurti's strategy eventually backfired a little bit, because he managed to alienate, or antagonize some sentiments in certain, especially in the PDK or the AIK, and sort of the war wing kind of parties, by trying to kind of out-patriotize them, and they felt kind of sort of angry at that. So it was really a symbolic campaign, not much focused on real issues. The dialogue with Serbia was not even there. Like it was talked about in the context of the past, but not necessarily in what they're going to do in the future. Everybody was trying to dodge that bullet. But yeah, so it was a patriot versus traitors kind of narrative from Kurti, with some elements of social justice, whereas the opposition was more like jobs, economy, and yeah.
Thank you. And then looking at the Kosovo's EU path angle in the past year, so in the last Kurti's mandate, Kosovo has made like important breakthroughs in the EU past, namely the application in 2022, which hasn't been followed yet by the Commission. Also, starting this year, finally Kosovo citizens enjoy visa-free regime in the EU, which was a long-awaited decision. However, at the same time, Kurti has been considered by many EU stakeholders as the responsible one for raising tensions in the north of Kosovo, and also for raising also like tensions with Serbia and not being constructive in the dialogue. That's why they imposed the so-called restrictive measures. I would like to ask you, like, how's your how do you assess how do you think that the results of the elections are gonna impact on that? Do you think that this trend is gonna change? Also, maybe the fact that Bete Mendoza is not going to be able to govern alone. Will this mean that Kurti will maybe need to have softer stances in these regards? Question open for whoever wants to take the floor first. Maybe, or Engjellushe, if you want to take the floor.
It's a little bit tricky. I don't necessarily agree that Kurti has brought a lot of tension. Well, there is obviously tension being reported, but then if you talk with international community, with EU and the US, but then if you talk to certain institutional leaders in EU and also in some specific member states, you don't get this feeling that there is tension. I include here Washington. I spent a few weeks there in October and just before elections, and the officials I spoke to, I mean, these were, of course, closed door conversations, but I also heard stuff like there has been some smart moves in the north and so on and so forth. Washington doesn't have the same administration anymore, so we don't have to go down that road and discuss what has been the relationship before. I think it's probably quite important to see what the relationship will be, no matter who take the government running Kosovo from now on. So what this relationship would be with the US, specifically, considering that US is not going to even, deal with the Balkans as they used to before, because there's so many other issues at the top of the agenda. But with regards to the EU, I think it matters a lot what how focused European leaders will be in the short term with regards to the Balkans, because again, there are so many other most pressing issues, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear it again and again that Ukraine is not the top of the agenda. There are so many other issues at the top of the agenda of European institutional leaders. Such as the fact what is going to happen with the security in Europe, the issues like Greenland, issues of trade, tariffs, so on and so forth. And then comes Ukraine and all the other stuff. But depending on this, how much focus can the EU give to the Balkans, and how much focus will maybe the new EUSR be able to give? I mean, not focus will probably be there, but what the approach will be. These are all the unknowns, and it's very difficult to tell what will this new relationship be, or a continuous of Kurti relationship. So I don't know. I mean, for me, it's difficult to say right now, and it doesn't really depend a lot on Kurti and Kosovo. It depends a lot on all these other unknowns at the moment, but let's assume, I mean, hypothetically speaking, that he will be back in power, and whether there will be an improvement of relations. Relations with the EU got, tensioned, and the US, mainly because of the dialogue with Kosovo. It was mainly focused there. We never saw an issue being, full of tension between Kosovo and US, for example, with regards to economic development. So it was all very much focused on the dialogue with Serbia. And I think when we talk about this particular process, we need to consider the context that was, well, in the making as of February 22, but also the context that we have right now. So as of February 22, we realized this very much, focus to pull Serbia away from Russia. especially from the US administration and the US representation there, and to somehow bring it fully under the sphere of influence of the EU. Everything else didn't matter. So Kosovo really didn't matter that much in this context. So Kosovo was seen as the weakest party, and the fact that it was always treated as a weaker party, like this, the attitude of Kosovars was in a way, self-colonization is fine. So, it was a bit of a shock maybe that Kosovars are not saying yes to everything anymore. And so if we think about the context again, I think what else could one do if one was, at the helm of Kosovo government with all these that I just mentioned, with all these factors and the context that I just mentioned? So I don't know. I mean, I will probably stop here because others will I'm sure have important stuff to add. But this is how I see the situation that could develop and what could be the potential repercussions of what we have at the moment in Kosovo, but also in the EU and in the EU-Euro transatlantic relationship.
Berta, did you
go ahead? Yeah. I saw that you unmuted yourself, so I just
right. Yeah. So so many things. But what I really would stress, going back to what Agon said about media stuff, I think, one, for me as a journalist, I wish that people voted. The elections happen on February 9th. We know who's in the U.S., who's going to be leading the U.S. administration. We know who is in top leadership roles in the EU. We know, apart from like a possible miracle happening in Serbia and the ongoing protest movement actually changing the government in the country, we know who Kosovo is going to be negotiating with in the EU dialogue. Between the two, I would, be the happiest journalist on this planet when, people who I talk to would actually think I'm voting for the person who I actually think about representing me in these contexts. And sadly, that is, that I didn't see that as being the case. I didn't see the dialogue, or I didn't see EU integration and other things be a major factor. I think people might have opinions on it, but it just wasn't a big topic of debate. The whole election was a campaign was framed as Kurti versus the world. And by the world, I mean both the foreign, international presence, regional presence, and obviously domestic one. Which I think on one hand, Kurti likes. He likes playing into that role. He thinks he can handle it. He knows, he's unlike Bedri Hamza and to some extent Lumir Abdijiko, something that should be emphasized is that PDK, despite their second being placed in second, they had a candidate that is not well known in public, or he hasn't been in the political scene in Kosovo for years, but he is not someone who's a figurehead in the way, say, former PDK leaders like Kadri Veseli or Hashim Thaçi were. And so it was really, and Lumir Abdijiko has been really building up his image since he took over the party after the last coalition between LDK and Vetëvendosje fell apart, the very short-lived first Kurti government. I thought actually expected, as a journalist, I thought that they would do better just based on the fact that they had more of an identity as a party. PDK, I think, has been largely unmoored since its leaders resigned to face charges at the specialist chambers. So having said that, I think, I don't know that the voters really thought about all these topics as much, which saddens me, because I think they're going to be much more important than a lot of the other things that were debated, such as who owns what television channel and what. But this is the nature of elections. A lot of domestic issues will always dominate them more than international ones, and in Kosovo's case particularly, because the EU perspective, and this is what people know, is, I wouldn't say that people are less pro-Western or pro-EU, but the EU perspective remains a very ephemeral, a very unclear and non-tangible concept, largely to the fault of the EU, and when I say EU, not because they're disinclined towards Kosovo per se, but because the way any kind of progress in Kosovo's side was set up is tied directly to the success of the dialogue, i.e. the role of Serbia, something that Engjellushe stressed importantly, the Kosovo is the junior negotiating partner, or the junior side in the dialogue with Serbia. It has very little things to operate with. Having said that, I think that Vetëvendosje supporters, there are very different kinds of Vetëvendosje supporters. And I think that there is a certain category of his support that comes from, that even, people might have ended up voting for PDK or LDK, but there are many people in Kosovo who appreciate sort of a leader that has more pushback. They don't understand the risks and the importance or whatever of the dialogue. They also don't understand what it contains, but they do feel like, after 25 or more years of somewhat of different types of political self-organization, that Kosovars need someone who will finally push back against Serbia. And this, Kurti, I think, overbet on this. I think he expected his the 500,000 mandate because of these things, because he's been, unlike the leaders of LDK and PDK, someone who's pushed back the most. And what Engjellushe said about bad relationships, so I mean, it is not as one-sided as, there are people in Brussels and in European capitals who are very frustrated with him. There are others in all these same situations that have an understanding for, who might publicly not criticize Serbia, but have an understanding for the difficult situation that Kosovo itself finds it in. Whether or not Kurti is the ideal negotiating partner for this is another issue. For example, the issue of political sanctions. I know it's an open secret at this point that many attempts to revoke the political sanctions have been vetoed by Hungary, mainly because when these sanctions were imposed, the EU, as it tends to, did not think ahead and never instituted any kind of sunset clause. So when they were imposed unanimously by the Council, but they were not imposed in a way that would include an easy way to get out of them. Imposed unanimously, expected to be removed unanimously, when in fact, but by that giving countries like Hungary the power to veto and condition that removal. So those are all the issues that are difficult. I think. Unless, Kosovo has, despite having 4 years of a relatively stable Kurti government, Kosovo, we forget that Kosovo's had a lot of very short-lived governments. Unstable coalitions have fallen apart. I don't disinclude the possibility of repeat elections, which Agon mentioned initially. I don't. The first Kurti government was negotiated for 3-4 months back in 2019 and early 2020. So its political instability definitely is something that we're expecting in the next couple of months. Sorry.
And I don't know if you, Agon, want to, thank you, Una. I don't know if you, Agon, want to add something as well.
Yeah, I just, I agree with most of what Una said. I just like to have, I think it's important to underline what this means to the opposition, the previous opposition parties, and how they view things now in terms of the EU perspective. I don't buy into this narrative in our domestic debates on the opposition being just sort of ones who are just, don't push back. I do think that they have agency in this. They've always had. There's just a different understanding within Kosovo of how Kosovo should fight its fight against Serbia in the international arena. And I do think the opposition has, in these elections, presented an alternative that some people believed, not as much as the opposition wanted. And I do think that this international dimension played a little bit of a role, indirectly. Indirectly, I would say by, for example, President Osmani, who was a major part of the Kurti's grand coalition in the previous election. And she had a very, I would say, public kind of expression of dissatisfaction with how Kurti handled international affairs. And she kind of became sort of the sort of person who was managing a lot of these relations. And she signaled to the voters, a part of whom went back to LDK or did not go to vote at all. So I think that is part of an explanation of how this international dimension and Kurti's antagonism with some of the West was impacted electorally through President Osmani and how she positioned herself in this election. We've also had this interference from Rick Grenell now, which I think was important because this is a new administration, somewhat unhinged, one could say, with less constraints than in the first Trump administration. So I do think that people take this into account. I don't think it had impact on the electoral result. Una is right. People do not, look into this that much. Maybe it even helped Kurti because it kind of inflamed some of his voter base. But I do think that what it matters mostly, how it impacts the election results, is how it impacts how the opposition thinks now. Because if they get some strong signals from the US, for example, in relation to Kurti, this will, they take this into account on how Kosovo should position in this situation. And I'll end here. I agree with what Engjellushe said earlier, that a Kosovo government has, what they need to see now is whether the West really is prioritizing this dialogue now or at all. Like, why would you need to create a government that is unstable to push ahead with the dialogue when the West is not really interested, and Serbia is in a position in which it is in where also there's a leader who cannot really engage in the dialogue right now. So I don't think the dialogue will necessarily be so central in these negotiations. It will mostly be domestic dynamics and sort of this our internal kind of power struggle. So yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I see, Una, that you are raising your hand. Go ahead.
Just very briefly, sorry, Engjellushe, for stepping into your time. One thing I forgot to mention that I think is really important is the dimension of Kurti's regional popularity. And this is, obviously this doesn't affect the elections, I said initially, due to the consequences of Yugoslav disintegration and the way in which states were formed. Kosovo Albanians in particular don't, and a million other things. That could be a panel on its own. There are a relationship with regional countries. It doesn't affect voting behavior as directly as, for example, Bosnia affects Croatia or Serbia affects Bosnia, and so on and so forth. But at a time when we see over a decade of the rule of Aleksandar Vučić and the negative effects it's had on the region, if nothing else, on the level of rhetoric and inflaming nationalism in countries like Montenegro, Bosnia, Montenegro and Bosnia in particular, I think that Kurti is seen as someone who, if nothing else, people know very little about his domestic policies, but if nothing else, someone who drives Vučić crazy. And this is, voting behavior-wise, I don't think it affected a lot, but I think it's an interesting angle because there was a very limited understanding of what PDK was like in power, what LDK or coalitions with AAK were like in power in Kosovo outside of the perhaps the trifecta, if I can call it, of like we're in Kosovo, Albania, and North Macedonia, where there are significant, there's significant political representation amongst Albanians. I think this is something that says a lot about the way he presents himself to the public, and whether or not he will be someone who will be interested in forming coalitions. I think Kurti is very empowered by the fact that he's seen as like a figurehead in the region, and sort of ceding power or making any kind of compromise with everyone else. I mean, he's a classical opposition leader. Like he governed as someone with the opposition with the mentality of an opposition leader, which isn't always effective, as we know. But this is something that I think the EU should take into account. Like this isn't someone, when there are punitive measures directed towards Kosovo or Kurti, it does have really negative reactions to people to his non-Albanian support base in the region.
Thank you for this.
Can I add very quickly a couple of things? I mean, the fact that he's such a strong political activist and was quite strong in the opposition, I think precisely why I think that it's going to be a little bit of an instability coming our way if he ends up in the opposition with 47 seats. Honestly, nothing will be moving forward if this is the case in Kosovo in the next few months, years. Plus, under this pressure of who's going to be the next president. But this is the reason also why I say that political class in Kosovo needs to be sophisticated or needs a bit more sophistication. Because what we have right now, in my opinion at least, there are some boring opponents of Kurti with all the negative and positive aspects of his. And so if you go today, you know, or observe the campaign in Kosovo, there are all these really boring issues. Economic development, you've done nothing. As if the others have created Kosovo, you know, or brought Kosovo into the golden age. And then you talk about the relations with internationalists. These are very, you know, boring topics if you want to play the opponent for someone like Kurti and all his kind of support that he has behind, because he has been a very, in my opinion, a very smart communicator in this campaign. And, you know, if you were to follow quite kind of, if you were to focus on the stuff that he had been saying during the campaigns that he had in different places, because of course he would repeat himself, but he would directly talking to people who have a lot of grievances. And so, you know, a political opponent would pick on these things, but I never saw this being picked up. There were these two blocks of issues as something that would harm him, and it was the economic development. And if you tell people economic development sucked under Kurti, you know, it's not very convincing. And if you tell them, look, international relations, when we have seen what, for example, you know, the American administration did in Serbia in the past couple of years, then it's not very convincing again to say, but I am the alternative. So anyway, I leave it here because I think thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that like the interventions of like the three of you has been like really insightful to actually understand what are the dynamics and like topics being discussed and the approach in Kosovo, because I think that like from Brussels, we often have this misunderstanding of like the approach and sometimes estimate, you know, like the role that the EU and the international community play in national elections. Now, I mean, following, we have two questions from the audience. Both of them are on the dialogue. So on the implications of the results for the dialogue. The first one is by Paul Taylor, who's a senior visiting fellow at the EPC. He asked, what does this result mean for the EU efforts to broker a settlement with Serbia? Are they dead? And then Dragan Stojovic from the mission of Serbia to the EU. He says, hello from Brussels for all panelists. What are your expectations from the new EUSR for the dialogue meter, Mr. Peter Sorensen? Yeah, do you think that like any like dynamics will change for the dialogue, like either because of the new government in Kosovo or the new confirmation of the government in Kosovo, or because there is a new EUSR? And so both, what do you think will change, or what do you think that should change?
Thanks, Agon. Hi, Paul. Lovely to hear you by the questions. So I think one major misconception with the way that the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia is framed is that it's a short-term process, or that it's a process that has to come an agreement, that it's failed so far because an agreement hasn't been produced since it started in 2011 with the technical level dialogue, and then got elevated to the political one. I think the EU, the people have to remember that the dialogue really was always designed to be a process that followed primarily Serbia's EU integration path. So as new issues would arise with, you know, chapters or clusters being closed, there would be, you know, issues pertaining to Kosovo. So borders, minority issues, you know, whatever that is, then that would get reverted back to the dialogue in direct, you know, which saw the two sides actually meeting and talking about it. So I think the dialogue is going to last until Serbia gets to its point. I mean, Agon and Engjellushe might disagree, but I think it's really it was designed also to last. Sort of this final settlement would only be achieved at the ultimate point, you know, when Serbia had wrapped up its reform path. That being said, we haven't mentioned, because there are always so many things to talk about when it comes to the relationship between the two, but we haven't mentioned the agreement that was reached in Ohrid, which has been, you know, obviously wasn't signed by Serbia, and then there was this whole scandal last year where the Serbian president at the time, now the Speaker of the Parliament, issued a letter sort of revoking Serbia's commitments to the dialogue. The EU at the time did not react harshly to this. This was something that shocked all of us because, you know, this is apart from having Vučić refused to sign the agreement, there was also no interest in, you know, Serbia sort of taking a strong stance against it was something that was really, you know, negatively affected the implementation of that. So more decisive action would be great. I don't see it coming from Marta Kos. I don't, you know, I'm not very impressed with her way of handling things in the region. We've seen how she's reacted to the ongoing events in Serbia, and just generally her understanding of the nuances and the sensitivities of the region are limited. I think she's challenged when it comes to Ukraine, let alone the Balkans. And so I don't see her being a strong force in that. With regard to the special envoy, I do think Sorensen is someone who has more experience in the region, has been based both in Kosovo and in Bosnia before in EU roles and non-EU roles. And I think that it could be invigorating for the dialogue, especially considering that, I mean, no matter how hard the previous sort of envoy Miroslav Lajčák tried to coordinate and maintain that relationship, I think there was always a perception on the Kosovo side that because of his Slovak background and the fact that the high rep for foreign policy was Spanish, that Kosovo was given an unfair sort of position in the whole dialogue. So I do expect Sorensen to do better. I guess this is answering kind of two questions, but Sorensen to do better than Marta Kos.
Thank you. You, Agon, wanted to take the floor as well.
Yeah, I do think that from Kosovo's perspective, I do think it's hard to see right now kind of majority be created to do the kind of sensitive stuff that Kosovo needs to do on this dialogue, and that is sending the ASM statute to the Constitutional Court, which is one of the Kosovo's kind of things that Kosovo has to do as part of the dialogue. I do think that anyone in Kosovo now reading the situation will not, you know, especially what's happening with Serbia, you know, like, you know, and domestically, you know, you will need to have a very, very strong coalition with strong legitimacy. That could only be done by a kind of coalition like Vedendosje and PDK, for example, in which they, you know, go heads on saying we have to finish this now. As for Sorensen, yes, more credibility. He seems more credible for Kosovo, as you know, he can regain some trust in the EU as a mediator. But for now, it just feels like a new gun with no bullets. So you know, some meetings will continue to happen on technical issues, but I don't expect anything major on the political front. You know, especially up until the elections in Germany, until the whole thing shakes up. And I'll end here. A lot also matters on how the US approaches the region. If we have a US approach that is not complementary to what the EU is doing, but comes in as sort of competitive, you know, and if the US decides to have a sort of trade war with the EU, and this kind of reflects on other policy areas, and also including the Balkans, this could change things. This could create new dynamics. So I think that's the kind of thing that should be watched. To be honest, that's the most maybe the most powerful dynamic that could come our way.
I have very little to add really to what Una and Agon have said. It's really not clear what the stance of the EU and the new EUSR will be with regards to the dialogue. Initially, HR VP Kala said that she's going to want to deal with it directly in a way, but she hasn't been able to even travel to the region. And I understand that this is not going to happen before end of March or early April. My worry is that, you know, while we are having this, in a way, transitional phase until the new institutional leaders get their act together in Europe, but also in the Balkans, in Kosovo in this case, that there could be a development in Serbia. Right now, I don't think there is much energy to focus in Kosovo because of what is happening in Serbia. But the worst case scenario could be that there is more attention backed by, you know, new US administration to the government in Belgrade, and they would want to have some more meddling in the north and go back to some type of governing in the north. This I see as a very, very bad scenario, not just for Kosovo, but to whatever has been, to the Ohrid agreement, to the, to whatever has been achieved so far. And then all accountability will go outside of the window on the Bańska and all sorts of other, accountability measures that EU is supposedly kind of asking from Serbia right now. So this is bad news. And yeah, again, let's see, this is just speculating on what can happen because we still don't know. It's not very clear. But once the government is in place, then we might see something happen. If I could add, it's very useful right now for Serbia, but also for Kosovo to have a little bit of prolonged instability so that they don't have to focus on these other pressing issues that, they have been nagging them. But this is just my kind of humble speculation.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that in the end, the role of the EU, of the US will also determine to a great extent what happens with Kosovo, with Serbia, and with the region in general. On this topic, I don't know if you, Una, want to add something on the US dimension to the dialogue and to the regional dynamics in general.
Yeah, we didn't get, again, because it's 1 hour and there's so much to talk about. People forget that, despite Kosovo being such a small country, there are many other countries who want to be involved in what's going on. And I was really shocked with Grenell and in Donald Trump Jr. Sort of sharing and sort of all these comments and stuff, criticizing Kurti, because at a time when so much is happening in the U.S. and everywhere else in the world, Grenell, after being, as we know, ambassador to Germany and then an envoy to the dialogue or to the Balkan peace process, whatever he was called, his position was officially called. He, there's so much more that he could handle. There's for me, that's giving a lot of oxygen at a time when everyone's eyes are sort of directed at the U.S. administration, giving a lot of attention to the situation in Kosovo, which means that it could be used for attempts to destabilize the situation, could be used for quick wins or for headline making sort of moves by the new administration. Trump did that in the first mandate too. He said he was, via Grenell obviously, but he was involved in the in sort of backing the Washington agreement. I remember this is Vučić and the former head of the LDK party both went to DC to sign the Washington agreement and stuff like that. So these are, even, as much as people often talk about Democrats being more interested in the Balkans, the sort of really highfalutin, intense, whether or not they were, effective is a different issue, but the intense sort of moves have actually were done during the Trump mandate. And I noticed that one of the members of the or a candidate from the PDK party actually sort of, which is an indicator of what it could do to destabilize Kosovo, right? Was I think he contacted House Committee on something or another member asking for an investigation into Jack Smith, who's the prosecutor who was involved in the trial, prosecuted Trump for both the stuff related to the January 6th insurrection, as well as the handling of classified documents that were taken to Mar-a-Lago. And he was the one who indicted Thaçi famously. And so what the opposition has shown, which is something they showed with the first Kurti mandate as well, the very first government, the one that lasted a month or however long it was, they won't shy away, PDK won't shy away from working closely with Trump to destabilize, just because of their sheer hatred for Kurti. It's this, Kurti and PDK are they exist as opposites of each other, and or have for most of the past 20 years. And if they're going to give Grenell or Trump an easy win by targeting Jack Smith and accusing him, which is what they have done, accusing him of disrupting the peace process between Kosovo and Serbia by indicting Thaçi, I think that could get really bad. And then that's why the EU, I think when the EU should step in. But my feeling is that they don't understand the situation at all, and that every response will be very delayed. Sorry for taking up a lot of time with my answer, but yeah, I won't be speaking for the rest of the time we have left.
Yeah, we are already on time. I will before closing the session, I would just give you the floor if any of you wants to, feels that has missed something or wants to add something to the discussion. No, it's fine. Okay, then I would close it here. I think that thank you so much for the really insightful comments and analysis on the situation. I think that now, first and foremost, we are going to have to wait until we have the final results and then see who is going to form a government and with whom. We are going to definitely continue closely monitoring the situation in Kosovo and the dialogue with Serbia as well as Kosovo's EU prospects. I would like to thank you again, the speakers, for accepting the invitation and taking the time today to participate in this online discussion, as well as to our audience for attending the event and for the questions. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Berta.
Thanks so
Bye.
much, everyone.